First of all, congratulations. This is an extraordinary show. I remember the first show with White Cube, and that wasn't the first time I'd seen your work, but it was pretty early on, and it's just been one of the joys of my life to follow Jeff's work since I first got to know it around the age of 18. I want to ask you, first of all, Jeff, since this is a kind of a moment for looking back, I know you do look back at your work, and you often speak about judging your past work. I also know that you proceed with no great plan, just one picture at a time as the opportunities arise. But when you do look back, what do you see? Do you see particular lines of development and directions? Are you surprised by what you've done?
I've helped to plan the exhibitions we've done this year, beginning with the one in Byler. And what became interesting was to group together pictures that somehow seemed to have some resonance between them, whether it was formal or on the level of subject, or maybe what you might call genre or something like that. Because when I do look back, I'm sort of surprised to see that I have created echoes between different pictures. And because I don't, and I really deliberately try not to, one, look back, and two, repeat myself, and three, work in groups, I'm not conscious of that when I'm doing them. In fact, what I am conscious of is trying not to do anything I've ever done before. So it's kind of interesting and sort of even disappointing in a way, or alarming that one sees things recurring. So for example, there are a lot of people sitting on the ground in my pictures, for example, right here. And one sees that quite a bit, and I don't really have an answer for it, but that's an example of the kind of thing that shows up without it having ever been planned, or I really thought about it being something I have done more than once. One of the maybe more interesting thoughts that emerged was something that I did comment on in the catalog for the exhibition in Basel, which is the presence of a kind of pastoral motif or structure. The way I interpret that as pictures of a kind of relationship of people to nature, which they would wish to have but probably don't have, or if they do have it, they're losing it, or if they do have it, it's conditional. And that becomes a kind of anti-pastoral, I would say. I think that's an underlying subject of a lot of my pictures, and I hadn't never really thought about it much until starting to look back this way.
I'm struck by the fact that the pictures have not dated, and I guess it's an inheritance of kind of modernism and what Walker Evans called the documentary style, that photographs would be somehow time-stamped in a very kind of contingent way, made in this time of day, in this month, this year. And that was an important part of what photography carried into the arts, but also into its kind of vernacular forms. But when I look at your pictures, I'm really amazed at how contemporary they feel, and they're not time-stamped in anything like that kind of emphatic or obvious way that we usually think about photography. Has that occurred to you?
Yeah, it's occurred to me a lot. I've learned a lot from painting, as I've said many times. And just to preface that, I have learned a lot from painting, but I don't do anything that's remotely like painting. I do photography. People have said to me that my work is so like painting, it must be sort of an ersatz painting. I really reject that point of view, because what I'm doing is essentially photography, and everything I do is photographic. But one of my experiences of painting is precisely that time suspension, where paintings that you really like, or paintings that I really like, often do have that sense of having not a temporality. I just went to see Van Gogh, and I think he's a good example, because some of his pictures really seem like they could have been painted today. There were a few in the exhibition that really struck me that way, mostly streetscapes that looked like snapshots, as a matter of fact. In any case, I think painting taught me there's a way of having a sovereign relation to time. That photography, in its documentary sense, either didn't want, or, I hate to say this, didn't think of. The reason I hate to say it is because I don't like to criticize photography in any way, because I'm just another photographer. I don't have a better position than anyone else. But like what you talk about, the time stamping is something that a lot of photographers want. That's what they want, that moment. I don't really want it, I have to say, or at least it's not primary for me. I kind of like the fact that some of my pictures from the 80s and 90s, you can't really distinguish much in them that couldn't be done now. I mean, this is 25 years old. It's a little dated, maybe, but people are probably still wearing Bukowski T-shirts. And so, in fact, I can imagine that it's not really that, things don't really look that different now than they did then. So I've actually tried for that. And I can't really tell you all in any great detail how I've tried for it, but I really have tried for it, because I think there's something really compellingly beautiful about that suspension where you're not locked into a moment, and the image has a freedom. That freedom's psychic, it's aesthetic, it's all kinds of stuff. So I have tried for it. For example, you will see very few advertisements in the backgrounds of my pictures. I don't put them in there. I avoid them because of precisely that sort of thing. And I would include one if it was necessary, but I've always found a way in which it shouldn't be necessary, because those kind of things tie you to a moment. I'm not against it, but I'm also not for it.
I think what excited me when I first saw your work, and it might be to do with the fact that cinema was my first love, and I sidestepped into photography from looking at film stills in books. I think what I liked about your work was not that it had anything to do with cinema per se, but just going back to the idea of the snapshot, because the snapshot closes the gap between observation and picture making almost into the same thing, I think of you as having expanded it. I know you often say, I begin by not photographing. You might notice something or read something or hear something, and that might be the beginning of the adventure of trying to make a picture. And so suddenly there's a much bigger gap between what we might think of as observation and the making of the picture. And I think of you as having explored. Okay, so you might regret having passed on the snapshot, but so much else opened up for you there.
Yes. When I say I don't photograph, I still consider not photographing an act of photography. It's a relation to photography that worked for me for some reason. Can't really explain it very well, but it kind of worked in the sense that the escape of the motif, let's call it the subject, the escape of the moment. What I experienced was the escape. And that's as decisive a moment or a decisive experience as capturing it. I mean, I think they're both the same thing. Remember that the camera doesn't realize it's missed a moment. So I like to think like a camera in that sense and not make judgments about whether I've done the right or the wrong thing. And I think that has to do also with artistic freedom. If we really believe that there is such a thing as really artistic freedom, that means we are really free to develop our relationships with our materials, our the subject matter, everything, as we kind of want to, I suppose. But I feel that there is a real photographic relationship in not making a photo, because it opens a new space. The space that opens has to do with my own personal capture, my memory, and my decision about the validity of what I experienced and didn't decide on at the time. Like, I was indecisive. So I'm pondering the validity of what I saw. There's no difference between that and a person who takes pictures than rejecting the picture after it's made.
Yes.
It's just a different path to the same point. But in that space, other things opened up. And I think that's where the word cinematography came in, because what was opened up was other ways of getting to making an image, or getting to make a picture, or let's say composing. And that space did get opened up in that way. Just that spaces got opened up by allowing myself to start from other things, like you say, from things I read or things people told me or whatever it happened to be.
I guess also with the snapshot, people think of the photographer not being so involved in the world. But as soon as you open that up, and you might be, for example, trying to find a location for a picture, or having to get into certain kinds of theatricality, or working with people, all of those things we do associate with cinema, although they've also been part of photography
Forever.
forever. I assume you enjoy all of that. I doubt you would do anything you didn't enjoy doing.
No, true. I think that what I call cinematography also emerges from the ability of the kind of the photographers who have to work on films to get themselves out of corners that they've been painted into by the situations that they're obliged to deal with. And that creativity is very important, I think, and it's led to a way of looking at photography that's not better, but it's a little more expanded, maybe, technically than otherwise. And as soon as you diverge from the direct relation of the camera to the moment, you open up a space that is full of problems, of new problems. And I guess I must enjoy those problems, but I also feel like my real commitment is to composition and picture making, and that what we really like about pictures is their goodness, meaning their well-madeness and the result of that, which is their beautifulness, shall we call it, not to avoid the word beauty, which people don't like to use anymore. So we'll call it beautifulness, which means a quality that nobody wants to admit they enjoy, but they do enjoy. Or that they feel that they shouldn't use that term, but they're nevertheless using it. And that beautifulness is the outcome of the making of the picture, or the sculpture, or whatever it happens to be. And that's a work of composition, and that work of composition is what all artists do. And my only objection to straight photography was that it meant accepting less freedom than a poet would have, less freedom than a musician would have, less freedom than a painter would have. And I didn't see from the beginning any reason to make that sacrifice in the name of some aspect of photography which is totally valid, but not all-encompassing. So yeah, of course I enjoy that sort of thing. And I like solving problems. Technical problems are fascinating. Like all physical work is fascinating. It's very satisfying to make something well, no matter what it is, in any domain. You know, art isn't the only place one makes well and enjoys it. Maybe one of the things that people like about art is they enjoy experiencing well-made somethings, whether it could be a shoe or a painting or a door handle.
I know it's a redundant thing to say that photographs are still and mute, silent. But I have to say that a big part of what I enjoy about your work is the stillness and the muteness. And that means the way in which a still image will suspend story and narrative, but it'll also suspend or evacuate sound. There's a number of your pictures where people are communicating and we can't know. There's at least a couple here I can think of, the listener and the storyteller, which you'd first of all think would be just antithetical as a subject, but they're actually fascinating because of what the stillness and the muteness can't disclose. So I guess you must be interested in the limits of the single mute still image.
I think the effect you're talking about is probably more related to the presence of them being in this tableau framework and the scale. I think it has more to do with the compositions and the overall making that suggests that there's something enhanced there. I think it also has to do, as I said, with the scale, because these pictures are so subject to gravity, the way they present themselves to you in this format, that there's a sort of enhancement of some of the ordinary or continuous qualities of photography. I like that, and that's something I did learn from painting, because remember that painting did invent this sense of the scale of pictures for us, in which pictures can occupy space and make us see what's in them in a way that's close to the way we see when we're not looking at pictures. That's one of the gists of what we consider any realism in art, is that the artwork resembles what you see in some way when you're not looking at art. For example, a lot of my pictures, not all of them, but many of them are at what I consider universal scale. Sometimes it's called life scale. That's the scale that we all see organically, because the universe is in one scale, apparently, at least the part that we know. So we kind of know that the entire universe that we can perceive is in one scale. So there's an objectivity about it that flows into the picture when you begin to use it, when you begin to work in that way. And that objectivity is kind of profound in a way that's hard to grasp. And I think that has a lot to do with the static nature. So the enhancement has a lot to do with you getting close to universal scale. And in some ways, I think that's why a larger picture has this strange ability to make you feel it's a little more, almost give you this illusion that it's more lifelike than life, because it's actually so close in that way.
Although interestingly, your relationship with White Cube started with an image that's a bit of a conundrum there. The Giant, which has this, it's an image of a nude woman standing on halfway up a staircase in a library, and she's completely out of scale with the space she's in. So how did you decide the final dimensions of that one?
Picture of a giant at universal scale as a picture would be rather difficult. The giant would be 30 feet high.
Yeah.
And even at that distance from the camera, she'd be 12, 13 feet high. The picture would be 30 feet high. I'm not Anselm Kiefer. can't make 30-foot high pictures. Therefore, that just seemed utterly implausible. And so that's another lesson that one can learn from the same place, which is universal scale. The game of universal scale isn't played the same way all the time. So I don't claim that working in that scale is the only good way to work. I think it's a ground note that can determine any way of working, and maybe make that way of working more interesting. So the giant ended up showing me that I could make very small pictures if I wanted to.
You mentioned that the tableau form is an invitation to make a judgment about whether one tableau is better than another, and that maybe we all somehow share that, even if the current cultural climate doesn't like the idea of judgment in that way. But what about the works that comprise more than one image? What is artistic judgment of a diptych or a triptych?
Judgment in what sense?
Well, what would make it good or not good?
I think what make it good would be the same as making anything else good. I mean, what we judge goodness as an aesthetic judgment. I mean, I've made my multi-panel pictures most of the time because something of the original subject, whatever it was, escaped in the process of me trying to either decide to do it or even making it. For example, it's not in the show, but I did a picture of two views of the same apartment. It was in fact the apartment my wife and I lived in here in London in the 70s, and I had to reconstruct it because I wanted to do a picture of a man on the floor in the sunshine. And I knew it wasn't me, and it really wasn't about me, really, but I wanted it to be in that apartment. Just as a side issue, part of the freedom that I like about this cinematographic approach is subjects can be detached from where they occur and move to another place where they occur better. They occur artistically better. So I worked on the motif of the single man, and at some point I knew that it wasn't going to work, unless there was another person in that apartment at some time. And so I added the woman who was in the second picture, which is photographed from a different angle. And from the angle that the two angles, you cannot tell that the people were ever in the apartment together. There's no way you can tell who's there first, and so on, but you can't be sure that they ever were in that apartment together. And that lack of certainty was also interesting. But the second image grew out of the first. And it grew out of the first because there's something in that subject that needed it.
The reason I asked the question, I think now, and I only realized this as you were speaking, is that I find in a lot of your multi-panel pieces something quite disturbing, psychically disturbing, but also disturbing of aesthetic judgment. I know you say you can judge a diptych or a triptych the way you judge anything else. Maybe it's just me, but if we take two examples, pair of interiors, and actor in two roles, it sets up for the viewer this almost kind of forensic checking of faces and details, and in a pair of interiors looks like a couple sitting on a sofa in a room, and then there's maybe another view of a different sofa in the same room, and it might be the same couple, but you look closely and it's different people. That's very disturbing.
Well, I mean, that's a little melodramatic, I have to say. But a pair of interiors is a picture that really emerged. I don't want to create any backstories in my pictures. You know, these days everyone has a backstory in their art. I really don't like that. I think the so-called backstory should be erased in the picture, in the experience of the picture. Nevertheless, I've always been struck by resemblances between people who don't actually look like each other. You're always seeing people who remind you of someone else. I always see resemblances between people, and when we look more closely at them, they don't actually look like each other. So that is a phantom experience that I find really fascinating. And that's all it was for me, was I wanted to find a way to bring that into visibility as a picture. I had spent a lot of time in that room because it's my house, and it just seemed like there was a way in which I could bring together a lot of energies that I was interested in. How to photograph a room, interestingly, which has got a lot to do with some of my multi-panel pictures, because as the yellow apartment I just mentioned is photographed from two very specific angles, which I love to do. That's not a trick I'm playing, it's just a condition of perception. It's just a condition of experience, a condition of how we relate to other people. And that seemed to be a very rich subject for a picture. It didn't seem like it would be so well done in a single panel, although I suppose it could be done that way. You know, the disturbing elements, yeah, that's disturbing. The identity, lack of identity, it's uncanny. I agree, there's an uncanny element. And I'm not against that.
Why photography? I've heard you talk about a kind of commitment to painting when you were very young, and then you were involved in that kind of conceptual moment that was quite anti-pictorial, although it used photography in some ways. And you finally commit, if that's the right word, to photography at an age at which most photographers of the prior century had already made their best work.
And I first got excited about photography in the context of conceptual art, like you said, because it was something different, and it was exciting at that point, and there was somewhere to go. So that probably had something to do with it. But the real fact is, I have no idea. If I really wanted to be a painter, I would be. That's the only answer I can give you. So if I really wanted to do, I would be doing it. And there's something that made me do what I'm doing, and I don't regret it. But I can't explain it. That's a bad ending.
It's a good ending.
All
it's
right.
a very good ending in the sense that I can't imagine you kind of picking up photography at that point and then dropping it again. So you must have sensed vistas in it somehow. Artistic vistas.
Let's say one thing about the big painting that's in the photo called Recovery.
Yeah.
because I made that painting in order to express the inner vision of this young man who had recovered from some hopefully happily passing affliction, because once you've recovered from something like that for at least a second, all is well. And if you know anyone who's been ill, you've hoped for their recovery, and if they do recover, all is well, even if it's just for a moment. And I wanted to get that I wanted to get that sense because I knew everybody could relate to it. And there's any number of ways of creating a hallucinatory image, but somehow it needed to be this painting that recalled pastoral paintings of the early 20th century. So I had to design the painting as if it were the thing that he was experiencing. And people said, "Oh, you're finally going back to painting and all that." But the fact is, the painting was no more of no more interest to me as such than, say, the construction I had to do to build the grave in the flooded grave, or the guy's room in The Invisible Man. It's just another construction that I had to make. So the only thing I can say is that if I ever was going to paint, I wouldn't paint like that, because that was not what it was for.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.